So I guess one question we can ask is, what are these traditional systems that banks and financial markets players use? And to a large extent, they are just regular computer systems, and they work pretty well. You look inside every bank. Behind me in this room, you can see tower blocks in the City of London. These are all different institutions, all different banks, and inside them are hundreds, if not thousands, of technologists building and managing and maintaining really quite sophisticated computer systems that are responsible for keeping track of all the things the bank does: customers' balances, the deals they've done with other banks, the contracts they've entered into with competitors and peers and their corporate customers and so forth. Those systems work pretty well. But there's a problem when you zoom out from the level of the firm and you look across the entire market. And that problem is, this information is recorded in multiple places. Any time a bank transacts with another firm, another bank, its customer, whatever it is, that information gets recorded at least twice in at least two different places. If the bank records it, and so does the other one. If it's a loan, then the lender records it in their system, the borrower records it in their system. So suddenly you've got this problem that what happens if that information is not the same? What happens if somebody's made a mistake? What happens if those systems are coded ever so slightly differently, so that maybe the information starts out the same, but then as it gets updated, as payments happen, as changes occur, maybe they get subtly but insidiously out of sync. And so this is like a fundamental problem in business, and there are things we can do to fix it. Reconciliation is the word that the accountants use to make sure that everybody's in sync. But it's kind of a bit nuts when you think about it. You think, you and I have entered into a deal, there's a meeting of minds. That's a test for a legal contract. There's a meeting of minds. We start out in sync, and then we go back into our own firms, we record it differently, and then from then on, we probably just diverge and we're never quite on the same page. So what Corda adds isn't attempting to replace those systems. It's intending to make sure those systems start and remain in sync, so that when the buyer and the seller, or the borrower or the lender, whoever it may be, once they record the information, Corda allows them to be sure that what they recorded to start with is the same, that the rules associated with those deals are the same and are correct. And then as the information evolves over time, Corda helps ensure that those two or more systems stay in sync. Because of course, in many situations, in many contracts, multiple firms are involved. So the net is Corda adds something to the financial market, to the business, to the markets, to markets in the world in general. It adds this ability to know that you're in sync with your counterparts and to stay in sync over time. Now, of course, if you want to be really ambitious and to think about where we're going, you could imagine that, well, if the starting point is these systems are brought into sync and remain so, Corda can do that using its flow framework, its identity layer, the peer-to-peer messaging, the way that Corda allows all these different systems to find each other and connect and exchange data. But in the more advanced implementations of Corda, we sometimes do go a step further and say, well, why can't Corda also become one of those systems? Why can't it be the system of record? Why can't it be the shared ledger for that market or that industry? So the net is Corda in its simplest guise, and what most of our customers use it for in the early days, is it's there to keep these systems in sync and just to eliminate this burden, cost, misery and risk of reconciliation. But where it allows those firms to go, the future it allows them to envision is one where those systems are replaced by industry level shared systems of record that are correct and consistent by construction. That's the prize we're aiming for, and that's what I guess makes it so exciting. Maybe we start first with this concept of double spend, because I guess until 10 years ago or so, nobody had heard of it. And although we do far more with Corda, the original intuition is still the right one. And it all comes back from almost a thought experiment that is, imagine you wanted to be able to invent digital cash. Imagine you had like physical cash, 20 euros, 20 pounds, or whatever it is. I can just give that to somebody physically in this room. I can pass it to them, and at the end of the process, they have it and I don't. It's either in my pocket or it's in theirs. It's in one place or the other. When I give it to somebody else, I don't keep a copy of it. I can't photocopy it. It's uncounterfeitable. But if I wanted to send it down this camera to somebody watching this video, I can't do that. I have to do it digitally. And if you think about like a naive way of doing that, you could imagine saying, well, I'm going to create a file on my computer that represents 20 pounds or 20 euros. Maybe I've got several of these files, and I look at them all and I can add them up and I know how much money I've got. And if I wanted to send it to you, well, great, we know how to do that. You do an email, you attach it as an attachment, you send it, problem solved. So I send my £20 file to you and you've got the money. But there's a problem, of course, and that problem is I've still got a copy. So that £20 has become £40. And I could send it not to one person, I could send it to a second person, a third person, a fifth person. I could create infinite money if that's how it worked. So of course it can't work that way digitally. What you need is a way to know whether the file you've got, the record you've got, is the current one, or has it been replaced by another one? Has it been superseded? Because if we had that, if we could do that, then I could take my money, I could email it to you, and you would know it was yours because you could see that my old one had been marked as spent. So mine was spent and yours was the current one. So that problem to make sure it can only be spent once and you know which one's which, that's the double spend problem. And different systems solve it in different ways. Bitcoin solves it with miners that consume a huge amount of energy. Ethereum now uses proof of stake. And in Corda, we use something called a notary. And the difference in Corda and the reason we went down that path is, imagine if that double spend protection went wrong. Imagine if something said it was spent, but it wasn't, or it wasn't spent, but it said it was. In the Bitcoin, in the cryptocurrency world, you just take that risk and it kind of works out. But in the business world where we operate, in the enterprise world, you really cannot afford for that to happen. And if it does, you need to know who you are going to sue, whose fault was it. And so the purpose of a notary is to be an identifiable entity or entities, one or more firms. You know who they are, you know what their identity is, and it is their job to say that token is spent and therefore this new one is the one that exists and is now owned by who you think it is. And you can generalize that because in Corda we don't just manage tokens, we manage legal agreements, contracts, derivatives, swaps, any kind of financial instrument you can think of. And they have very much the same problem. How do I know the version I'm looking at is the current one as opposed to a previous version? How do I know if two parties to a contract try to update it at once, who came first and who came second? So the net is, anywhere in the digital realm where you've got identifiable businesses trying to transact with each other, very often you need to know whether the record you're looking at is the current one, and the notary is Corda's way of doing that. So staying ahead of the curve it's the really hard question, and the way the question was phrased, it was not only how do we stay ahead, but how do we stay ahead in the light of innovations happening elsewhere, and I think that's a good way to unpack it, because staying ahead, we always have to make sure we're clear about what is our market and against whom are we competing, because I look at some of the work we're doing and it's very, very relevant to and very related to the public crypto markets. But some of what we're doing is genuinely different and genuinely novel. A lot of the inter-firm workflow, the decentralized workflow between regulated entities we do is unique. Nobody else does that. And so as I look at the work we're doing to stay ahead, one is, and this is something that I think some firms miss, even though it's kind of the most obvious and easiest thing to do, is actually listening to our customers and watching what they're doing with the product. Because I cannot tell you how many times I visit our clients or speak to them, ask them what they're doing, and they're not using the product in the way I expected. They've found something else it's good for, or they're using it in an unexpected way. And that is such a good source of new requirements, because you realize, oh, so they were actually trying to do X. The product doesn't quite do that, but if we tweaked it, we could make it easier easier for them to do it, and suddenly the product would be more attractive to another group as well. So one way to stay ahead is almost to look backwards and find out what your customers are using it for, and the bits around the edge where it didn't quite do what they wanted and they themselves innovated. The second thing is to look at what's happening in the public market. What is successful in DeFi, what is successful in the Web3 space, which parts of that are relevant to our customer base, can we make that accessible to them, or can we interoperate with them? And the third part is we have to make sure we don't get trapped in the blockchain silo. There is innovation happening far more broadly in the tech sector, and it's incumbent on everybody in R3, certainly the technologists and definitely me and the other senior technologists. It's our responsibility to the firm and our customers to watch what's happening elsewhere and figure out, that's relevant. If we were to combine it in this way, we could change the product in that way, making sure that we don't just think we're a blockchain product. Blockchain is part of how we deliver our value proposition, but the problem we're solving is tokenization, is digitization, it's inter-firm workflow and inter-firm reconciliation. They're the problems we're solving for our customers. How we solve them is more of a detail, and so we should be using all the techniques and technologies that are available to us. So net, watch what our customers are doing, watch what's happening in the broader blockchain ecosystem, but also look at technology more broadly. Yeah, without a doubt. So maybe one way to see why and how is to unpack what we mean by decentralized finance. Probably the main deployment of that approach right now is in the public networks. And if we look at, say, the Ethereum mainnet in particular, one of the key technological innovations that underpins it is this thing the Ethereum community call composability. And by that I mean, if you look at something like Uniswap or Compound or Aave, some of these very popular and successful smart contracts on those networks, they allow you to lend or borrow crypto, they allow you to swap one token for another. And yet the tokens that are being bought and sold, lent and borrowed, whatever it might be on that network, they weren't invented by the deployers of those protocols. They were issued by completely different firms. And yet these things just plug together like Lego. They just sort of interoperate and compose is the word. And that ability and the innovation that's been unleashed there has collectively become known as decentralized finance. The problem, of course, is that the tokens being exchanged are typically crypto assets, unregulated, very difficult for regulated institutions to engage with. And yet the technological innovation and the rate of progress is something that everybody in the financial markets is looking at and would like to be able to adopt. And so I think what we're seeing is the emergence of terms, perhaps you'd call it regulated decentralized finance or institutional decentralized finance, institutional DeFi, where those principles of reusable code building blocks that can plug together with other pieces of code, but in a regulated way, is going to be ever more important. So if we look at what we're doing in the next generation of Corda, composability of contracts is top of mind and is a key feature that will be coming. Corda already interoperates with the EVM ecosystem pretty well. And so we're only going to see more examples of a crossover or a convergence between those two worlds. But of course, from my perspective as CTO of R3, I can't lose sight of the fact that my primary clients are regulated financial institutions, and so they can't just jump wholesale into the completely unregulated space. They need a way to benefit from the innovations there while still respecting the constraints they're under for obvious legal reasons. But DeFi, this enabler of rapid financial innovation tied with the institutional and regulatory context, it's top of mind. So interoperability is I think it's probably a misunderstood topic in many ways. Because I think a few years ago as a CTO of R3, when I was leading the development of the version of Corda we had then, I was asked a lot by clients, prospects, even my own team members, what are we doing for interoperability? And back then, I always thought the discussion was a bit premature, because until you've got successful live networks processing real transactions and doing real business, connecting them to something else is kind of an irrelevance. But we're past that point now. We now have multiple high-value, really important live Corda networks. And there are live networks on other platforms as well, primarily EVM-based, based on the Ethereum virtual machine. We see Hyperledger Besu, for example, being very successful. And so naturally and inevitably, the question arises, how can we make sure that these high-value, important and useful networks can talk to each other in ways that make sense, are seamless, and are useful? And so what we're focusing on is making sure Corda is, if you like, almost a polyglot, able to talk every language. It can interoperate with anything that is relevant to our customers. So we're focused right now on the short-term requirement for many of our customers, which is to coordinate transactions between Corda-based networks and EVM-based networks, so that if an asset on a Corda-based network needs to be swapped at the same time as an asset on an Ethereum-based network, we can do that reliably and securely. and then over time we'll move that on to bridging and maybe connectivity to other networks. But interoperability is one of my top priorities right now, because over the last few years it's all been about getting our customers live with their networks, and now it's about connecting them to other networks and doing it in a way that respects blockchain principles, doesn't require the unnecessary addition of more third-party intermediaries, and which is reliable and is compliant with the appropriate regulations. So interoperability, it's never been more important. So we were very fortunate in how we began. I think people don't realize this, but R3 did not begin as a software firm. R3 began as a consortium of literally dozens and dozens of the world's largest banks. They came together because they saw a need to figure out what the opportunity, and frankly the threat, but primarily the opportunity of blockchain might be for their business. So we worked with them. We implemented that consortium, if you like, for those banks, and so we were able to work with them to figure out what is the problem they're trying to solve. What are the issues in financial markets and banking more generally that are presently causing them so much pain, and which blockchain technologies, which DLT, could plausibly solve. So from that initiative, from that work, came the requirements for Corda, and then came the Corda platform itself. Since then, we R3 have evolved into a software firm. So from our beginnings as a consortium and our discovery that Corda could solve problems with the banks, we evolved into, as I say, what we are now, which is a software firm who's responsible for safeguarding, shepherding Corda, bringing it into the future and making it available for anybody who could benefit from it. And so the reason why it meets the needs of banks so well, in my opinion, is because we genuinely listened over an extended period of time to the problems they had. We didn't just say, hey, blockchain's cool, let's see whether we can force it down their throats and jam it in appropriate ways. So that's why Corda began as relevant and useful for the banks. But of course, that's not enough. You have to keep innovating and you have to keep moving forwards. So the two things we do in addition, which you'd expect, but you do have to focus on it. One is continuing to listen to these banks. Corda Next Gen, the next generation of Corda, is a key part of that. As banks used Corda for more and more advanced and important and mission critical workloads, we realized that the original assumptions we had about how it should operate no longer held. We had to fundamentally re-engineer it. So again, listening to the customers, that's what led to the new version of Corda. But also, of course, we're very tied into what's happening in the public cryptocurrency and blockchain networks. Those networks can often iterate quicker and innovate quicker because they don't have the regulatory constraints that our customers have. And so sometimes we can watch the experiments happening there, figure out which ones work, which ones are relevant, which ones can be adopted, and then we bring that back into the Corda ecosystem. And of course, the final point is we then try and interoperate and connect these things. So net, don't lose sight of your customers. We always try and listen to them, but we also keep an eye on what the broader ecosystem and community is doing.